Get started. Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. We are currently reading and exploring Eudora Welty's 1941 short story collection titled A Curtain of Green and Other Stories. During this series, we will read and discuss 3 stories each week between now and February 12th. We are back now from a 4-week winter break. It is so good to see all of you, and today we are going to be discussing A Memory, Clytie, and Old Mr. Marblehall. I'm Jessica Russell, director of the Eudora Welty House and Garden. Suzanne Mars, who normally leads these discussions, could not be with us today, so we have a very special guest leader, our very own fellow Welty at Home member, Harriet Pollock. Harriet hardly needs an introduction to this group, but she will get one nonetheless. Harriet Pollock, College of Charleston, is the author of Eudora Welty's fiction and photography, The Body of the Other Woman, and editor of 8 volumes, including Eudora Welty's Eudora Welty and Mystery, Hidden in Plain Sight with Jacob Agner, new essays on Eudora Welty, Class and Race, Emmett Till in Literary Memory and Imagination with Christopher Metris, Eudora Welty, Whiteness and Race, and Eudora Welty and Politics, Did the Writer Crusade with Suzanne Mars. In 2019, Harriet inaugurated and now edits the ongoing University Press of Mississippi book series, Critical Perspectives on Eudora Welty. Just some housekeeping. To comment or ask a question, be sure to click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and select the raise hand button. I'm going to be looking and Harriet's going to be looking for your raised hands. If you're on a tablet or phone, you might have to tap the screen for that option to appear. A lively discussion also takes place in the chat as well, so be sure to glance over at the chat box every now and then. Speaking of the chat for today's discussion, when we get to Old Mr. Marblehall, I'm going to post some special images that Harriet has shared with me. And now, Harriet, where should we begin today's discussion?
Well, I think I'd like to do a little introduction to how I read Welty. I think that we all read with all the tools that we can call up. Our friend Suzanne Mars is particularly wonderful reading Welty through biographical detail. And she and I have sometimes joked that while she reads with biography, I read with fictional patterns. But you will usually end up in the same place. More than biographical history, I tend to watch for Welty's play with literary history, with literary forms. I think her stories routinely call up story types and story conventions, and then refuse to fulfill our readers' expectations for what comes next in that form, presenting us with the pleasure of surprised anticipations. I've called Welty's signature stories puzzle texts because we puzzle over them. For example, we recognize A Memory as a first love story, and then it's not. So I think about Welty as a modernist innovator, referencing old literary forms, constructing with them, often with a female swerve. If I'm watching for patterns across story types, I'm also interested in patterns that repeat in a writer's work. And I've been especially interested in Welty's girl stories that repeatedly pair a middle-class daughter with another woman, underclass or immigrant, not a lady by class or background, who Welty's privileged and protected daughters observe in particularly unladylike self-exposures that fascinate. In all these duets, all these pairings across Welty's career, the underclass character freely transgresses behaviors of privileged ladyhood by making a spectacle of herself. These other women may appall or attract, but they always fascinate the story's privileged daughters. And then lastly, as a reader interested in the topic of race, I think about behaviors of whiteness in Welty's fiction, a topic I think she attends even when there are no Black characters in the fiction at hand, even in our stories for today. So let me turn into those stories and A Memory with its, I think it's a path-breaking modernist story that can certainly be mystifying It's an early story. It was first published in Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren's Southern Review in 1937. And that's the issue just after they published Piece of News. So she's just coming on the forefront in these publications. Its setting is sometimes identified to be Livingston Park in Jackson, which opened in the 1920s. I understand amidst considerable controversy about proper attire and behavior required of women. I thought we could start by talking about the voice we hear in this story. So different from Sisters or Leota's. What do we know from it? To give you something to draw on, I thought I'd read the second paragraph of the story, and then ask you to unpack, think about the voice that we're hearing and what we understand. Since this was a weekday morning, the only persons who were at liberty to be in the park were either children who had nothing to occupy them, or those older people whose lives are obscure, regular, and consciously of no worth to anything. This I put down as my observation at that time. I was at an age when I formed a judgment upon every person and every event which came under my eye, although I was easily frightened. When a person or happening seemed to me not in keeping with my opinion, or even my hope or expectation, I was terrified by a vision of abandonment and wildness that tore my heart with a kind of sorrow. My father and mother, who believed I saw nothing in the world which was not strictly coaxed into place, like a vine on a garden trellis to be presented to my eyes, would have been badly concerned if they guessed how frequently the weak and inferior and strangely turned examples of what was to come showed themselves to me. So what do we unpack from that voice? And Jessica, I cannot see the top bar for some reason on my computer today. So if you'll just
I
recognize.
got you. I'll watch for the hands.
Okay.
Monica.
Good morning. I'm so glad to see all of y'all. And this is one of my very favorite of Welty stories for lots of reasons. But reading it this time, something I hadn't thought about, and it has to do with this voice that you're talking about, Harriet, is I hadn't realized just how much she evokes what I now recognize and what I didn't as a teenager recognize as anxiety and panic attacks. And there's that last sentence in this paragraph that you read, that how frequently the weak and inferior and strangely turned examples of what was to come showed themselves to me. There's this underlying bedrock of anxiety that I hear in this voice.
Yeah, a kind of fragility. What's that about? Yeah. Monica, are you still there?
Joellen has raised her hand.
Okay. I'm going to make a kind of obvious point that we have an adult narrator in the first person looking back at her girlhood. And we have a bunch of clues to that in the first. When I was a child, my observation at that time, past tense. But the very last sentence in that paragraph shows the passivity of the girl character. The weak, inferior, strangely turned examples of what was to come showed themselves to me. At this point, she might not have been looking for them, but they showed themselves, and the story is in part a reaction.
Yeah, I take that in two parts and say, I think it's really important that we realize that the narrator here is standing at some distance from herself. And I hear it both when she says that she formed a judgment, or when these people were lives obscure, irregular, and consciously of no worth to anything. I put that down to my observation at the time. And I hear it again when we're on the beach, and she sees the beach folk, and she says, they were brown and roughened, but not foreigners. When I was a child, such people were called common. So I think one thing we're thinking about is the distance between the adult narrator and the child narrator, and whether what change we understand.
Even though, sorry,
Oh, yeah.
even though it goes into the next paragraph starting, I do not know even now what it was I was waiting to see. And at the beginning of this story, of this narration, the narrator might be in a slightly different position than she is as we keep going.
Mhm, mhm. And I wonder about the passivity. I don't think I would say that, because I think that there's a struggle going on that has to do with moving from maybe what was passive, even in the context of
Mhm.
recording. Jacob, do I have your hand up?
Yeah, I want to add to that. It's in a typical Weltian way. It's hard to figure out narratively what the story of this is, if there is one. But if we're looking in a story for action, if we're looking for something that's not passive, if we were to keep kind of challenging that term here, that the fundamental act that seems to occur from the narrator is in that first paragraph. The line, "From my position, I was looking at a rectangle, brightly lit, actually glaring at me, with sun, sand, water, a little pavilion, a few solitary people in fixed attitudes, and around it, all a border of dark, rounded oak trees, like the engraved thunderclouds surrounding illustrations in the Bible." Here's, I think, the important line. "Ever since I had begun taking painting lessons, I had made small frames with my fingers to look out at everything." I think that's an important moment in the story that is an action that the narrator is doing. The question perhaps is, why is she doing that? And what is the intent of the action?
Yeah. So let's talk about that. That is, what is this gesture of squaring her fingers to look through about? And are there different ways that we understand it?
I'm wagering that's not a passive moment, is what I guess what I'm trying to say.
Gotcha. Monica?
Thank you, Jacob. That was exactly what I was thinking about. That may be one way that she tries to keep anxiety at bay, right? Is like use this lens that she's learned, right? That she's learned to use in her art class, that ties into this larger theme that I saw in reading both Memory and Clytie together, which is both of these stories have this theme of using dreams as a defense mechanism. And so in this story, it's this kind of like this art strategy that she's used to like literally, okay, I can deal with this much of the world right now. So in this way, dreams and the artistic creative process seem to be a way of dealing with the world, of keeping herself together.
Yeah, I'm hearing sort of two senses of this squaring in what you're saying, Monica. Both a sense of an artistic framing, but also a sense of defense or distancing or attempt to control the thing that's causing anxiety. And I think we still have to talk about what's causing the anxiety. But I'm remembering that Catherine Ann Porter, in her introduction, talks about that gesture. She says, a memory, one of the best stories, there might be something of early personal history in the child squaring her hands to bring the observed thing into a frame, the gesture of one born to select, to arrange, to bring apparently disparate elements into harmony within deliberately fixed boundaries. I think we've talked a lot about Porter's introduction, saying things about stories that we might not agree with, but maybe we agree with this. That is, are we looking at youthful artistic prescience or are we looking at a defensive, protective reaction to disorder, or both? And then, of course, there's the framing with fingers that reminds us too of Welty as a photographer, and that connection to an early personal history. What do you think?
No, I like that. And I'm thinking, yeah, I love the connection of the photography, and also, her own, if we're going to do the biographical reading, her own experience of this as an actual memory of a boy that she had a crush on. And that may be part of the vulnerability or the feelings of fragility here is, this dream of this boy that she has, that then maybe she's aware of her vulnerability throughout, that then, in the end of the story with that fantastic family on the beach, that is one of my favorite descriptions in all of literature, makes her is even more threatening.
Yeah, well, I mean, the story is called A Memory, and you say we've got a memory of the boy and her first love, but it's not really, it's almost a memory and a memory, but it's important, I think, that she brings them together and says this is one memory, a memory of the juxtaposition of the girl's thoughts about the boy at school and her thoughts about the family on the beach. What do we think connects those things? Should we talk more about the boy in school, and also, again, this source of anxiety in the girl? Sarah?
So I want to think about how what seems like two threads we have going right now, the anxiety, what she's concerned about, as one thread, and a second thread of the voices in the story. We have the adult remembering the child. To me, those come together with a sense that the thing being observed also has agency in the story, that we actually have three points of view. We have the adult remembering the child, we have the child viewing. But in the third paragraph, she says, from any observation, I would conclude that a secret of life had been revealed to me. I'm really interested in that passive voice. It's as if there's something out there revealing. So I think the bathers, the young man, all of that is a kind of moment of anxiety because she can't completely control, although she wants to with that frame, how she's telling the story and what's out there, because there's that object out there, the boy, the bathers, whatever else might pop up, that's going to affect her story or affect how she sees things. So that to me is the source of the anxiety. She doesn't have control over the story.
Yeah, I hear you saying that that the girl is busy, that she's been protected. She's we have these parents who would have put everything arranged on a trellis for her eyes, and now she's seeing other things, and those other things, she's eager for them. She's maybe escaping the protection, but she's also anxious about the discoveries. I wanted to take us back to a sentence about the boy. That is, she says, "I was in love for the first time. I had identified love at once. The truth was that never since has any passion I felt remained so hopelessly unexpressed within me." Is that, what do you think about that?
Jacob has his hand up.
I think I kind of want to add to Sarah's point. Just I really agree that reading it this time around, I feel like there's a growth that takes place with the narrator, given, or in the first moment when she discovers the power of framing, the way she puts her anxiety at bay, and the way she creates a distinction between that which is in the frame, that which is safe, that which is artistically and coherently ordered, and everything outside of the frame, which is the world of wildness, the world of unpleasantness, ugliness. That's the first moment where the artist seems to, or the young artist child has a moment of like power. She describes it as love. She falls in love with that power. But there's this second moment that I think Sarah was evoking. And I think it's a moment of maturity where she realizes that even the things that are found within the frame, in this case, the boy or the family at the beach, those things that she thought were controlled by the frame, what we find out, or she finds out, they're not in control. They are much more in depth and mysterious than she expected. Thus, we see that moment of violence, of blood, and that makes her pass out. The frame did not contain that. And in the next case, it's this family that moves within the frame with such abundance and chaotic energy. We even hear words like that. So even the frame is almost threatening to break. And that, I find in the latter half of the story, that's a really fascinating moment where the artist is almost realizing that her power is not, she's not in full control of it and doesn't have the language to make sense of it, I guess is what I want to add.
Mm-hmm. So this anxiety is about control. It's also about escaping protection. With the sentence that I was reading before, I was thinking about it also being about passion remaining hopelessly unexpressed in her. That this is a boy that she has never spoken to. This is a boy that she doesn't know. She worries about his house might be shabby. She worries about the nosebleed. She isn't trying to talk. She isn't trying to express her love. She doesn't yet know about love, but she's already seems to have learned that a young lady is not supposed to speak. So again, when I'm thinking about what she's maybe not so passively escaping, she's caught in this young ladyhood, but she's also at odds with it. She's also bristling with a sense of there being more outside the frame that she's starting to see. Talk about the family on the beach that displaces her fantasy love for the boy. What is it that we're that's happening in that displacement of the love for the boy?
Harriet, I see Joe Ellen and then Bill. And then I wonder if we should move to the next story after Joe Ellen and Bill.
Oh, too fast, but okay.
Yikes. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the family is never within her frame. Is that right? She never tries to frame them, but it's this kind of chaos going on outside her. But I want to go back to that, I guess, fourth paragraph in the story, the state of exaltation. The truth is that never since any passions I felt remained so hopelessly unexpressed, which means that's changed in the adult narrator's life, or appeared so grotesquely altered in the outside world. So the grotesquerie that she sees in the bodies of the family, it suggests have altered her love. And since we're going to be ending, let me jump us to the very end, where the girl is alone on the beach again, squaring her vision with her hands and thinking about going back to school. And she says, I could imagine the boy I loved walking into a classroom where I would watch him with this hour on the beach accompanying me, accompanying my recovered dream and added to my love. So that gets processed, at least by the adult, thinking that the young girl even feels that. But somebody else might want to say something about the nature of the family.
Bill?
I was struck by everything that had been talked about or written about up until this state of exaltation. And what is a state of exaltation? It's love, it's anxiety, it's dread, it's seeing the ugliness of the world, the beauty of the world, all at the same time. And so it's real easy to get caught up in just the negative stuff. But she says also in that third paragraph, looking out by this device to see everything. And I'm going to suggest that it's seeing inward too, because the very next phrase she injects here is, which appeared as a kind of projection. So she's seeing what is inside is going out there, and what is coming in is also inside. And when you first discover that, that is a moment of maturation. And so that framing like that is, and she says it didn't make any difference what she was looking at. Basically, she was in love with whatever she saw. And then she had to face the fact that she loved everything she saw, including all this negativity and all this ugliness. So it's just such a powerful story.
It is.
And I remember that in my own life, being young and being in love, and how long that stayed. It brought back a memory, almost 60 years old. So it's a powerful story.
It is. I think it is a gateway story for Eudora, and I think that it is, but it's surprising. That is, we've had the boy blossoming like a rose in her mind, and then there's this family, and particularly the woman in that group. So I'm thinking about the displacement of her fantasy of love by this fleshy, unnamed woman on whom fat hung like an arrested earthlight on the hill, with breasts like widening pears. And then there's this scene of the woman's overexposure. And I'm reading, amid the thud and fat impact of the family's bodies on one another, the woman, and now I'm reading, bent over and in a condescending way, pulled down the front of her bathing suit, turning it outward so the lumps of mashed and folded sand came emptying out, and I felt a peak of horror, as though the breasts themselves had turned to sand, as though they were of no importance at all, and she did not care. Is this the climax of the story? Why? What's happening here?
Monica?
Well, here is where we see something happens, right? Edith Wharton would have put some asterisks, would have put dot here, would have put ellipses here, because the next paragraph is, when I finally emerged. So right, she has some sort of, she feels this as an attack. The woman's ugliness is like injuring her, which I just love. But then she says, from the protection of my dream, the undefined austerity of my love, and then she opens her eyes onto the blur of an empty beach. So much happening in that sentence. We have the blur of the empty beach, right, in contrast to the photographic approach that she's used so far. That again, that's something that I hadn't realized until this reading, this use of dreams as a defense mechanism. So again, I think that I certainly see this as the climax of the story, and then what we learn about the narrator in that next paragraph is just fascinating.
I tend to think that the two parts of the story are what brings them together. What makes them one memory is that they're both about a kind of anxiety about exposure, and this woman on the beach is not literally dissolving. It's the girl's fantasy, or the girl's the vision of her in public exposure, causing a woman to physically dissolve. Her breasts are turned to sand. And she feels a peak of horror as the breasts themselves had turned to sand, and the woman is dissolving. I'm thinking about a kind of daydreamed mental picture that is a revelation of the perceived danger that the adolescent is exploring, of exposing herself to things, of exposing her, potentially exposing her feelings to the boy, of exposing herself to these secrets that she sees around her. The woman is huge, and I think that's in correspondence to kind of regulated, neat, petite, miniature womanhood that the girl has been maybe raised to escape, so I think that gets us to the question of the speaker's view of her younger self. Do we think that the older self is different from the adolescent that she remembers? And if so, how?
Bill, your hand is up. Were you curious about that question, or was there something else you wanted to have on your mind?
Oh, thank you for, yes, that's an interesting question. I wasn't going to address it, but she says, when finally I emerged again from the protection of my dream, the undefined austerity of my love. It's the second time she used austerity. You know, she said in the 5th paragraph, my love had somehow made me doubly austere. You know, so some austerity had been stripped, and it was the external judgment and all that kind of stuff she had applied to the family. This stripped it, and now she's left with that undefined austerity, that plainness and simplicity of love that is not definable, you know. And so that's all I saw in it.
Gotcha. So you're saying that that there is something austere that the girl is finding in her love, and am I following you?
Yeah, she in that 5th paragraph, she said, my love had somehow made me doubly austere in my observations of what went on about me. So this ugly family, shall we call them that? I wouldn't necessarily say that, but she did. And she closes her eyes. She goes back into her dream about her friend. And when she opens it again, it's now singly austere. The other austerity had been her judgment of what was going on around her has been removed from her somehow. That's how I read it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I just think that what is the difference between the child and the adult narrator is that this older narrator is risking exposure in the story by presenting it without mediation, without telling us how to feel about the girl, and that it's if the child is anxious about exposure, the story, the narrator is a young woman claiming and risking the task of self-exposure, maybe in writing. I mean, I do think of it as a kind of gateway story for that is about anxiety of maybe the anxiety of writing, and that there's a transformation that goes on between the child and the adult narrator.
Lots of good comments in the chat, and Monica's hand is raised.
Well, I
Monica?
wonder if I could use this as an opportunity to transition over to Clytie, because there's this great something that's fascinating about reading these two together. We've been talking about the end of a memory where she's she emerges from the protection of her dream, and just 3 pages into Clytie, Clytie went to the kitchen and lighted the kindling in the wood stove, and it says, now some dream was resumed. So I wonder what parallels you see between it really makes me think about the narrator of a memory with her dream as a kind of defense against that's momentarily threatened by this family on the beach. And then in Clyde, who has this dream that protects her as well from an also obnoxious family.
Yeah, another obnoxious family. Okay. Well, I was going to start with saying, this story appears in the Southern Review in 1941, and it is a story that calls up a familiar story form, the Gothic, and I'm thinking about what it's doing with that form. I mean, it is very different in tone than a memory. The voice is very different here. What's it doing with that form? Is Welty writing the form of the Gothic, or is she altering it? What are the elements that we recognize? Maybe that's that family that Monica's comparing to the family on the beach. Talk to me a little bit about that. Your sense of what Welty's doing with story form in this. What are the elements that we recognize as conventional, and how does the story? How is it altered?
Sarah.
Okay. I told Harriet I love Clyde. It's one of my favorite. So I do think she's playing with the Gothic form. I mean, we have a dark, confining house. We have a family that's kind of gone to ruin. We have things that, echo Poe and Faulkner and Hawthorne. We have all that. But I think the twist is Clyde. Clyde's a very interesting character to throw in a Gothic story. I think Clyde would really rather be in a different kind of story, but she got put in a Gothic story, and there she is. She's kind of stuck. But she tries to get out of the house. She loves nature. She loves green things. She loves faces. She loves connection. She tries to do all these things, even though she's that trapped damsel. She doesn't want to be the trapped damsel. And so I do think we get Welty kind of doing this hypothetical, what if I have a damsel who does not want to be in distress, doesn't want to stay in the house? Can she get out? She does get out. It's just not in a really wonderful way.
Yeah, I've been thinking too about material culture in Welty, about things that talk. And this house is one of those things.
Oh, yeah.
It's also a family that we recognize as a kind of the inhabitants of a kind of museum of Gothic conventions. We have paralyzed father and crazy dominating sister and drunken violent brother and suicided other brother, and people talk about the Faulknerian influence here. Maybe we should talk a little bit about Clyde's name. I don't know if anybody knows the mythological Clyde and the other mythological references in the story.
Jacob and Bill have their hands up. Jacob and then Bill?
Though I may not have something to say off the top of my head about the name, but I really do agree with what Sarah just said. I mean, one of the fundamental tenets of like classic Gothic tales all the way back to the 1700s is simply the tale of trapped femininity. It's often a woman locked in a castle, locked in an abbey, in this case, locked in a southern home, trying to escape. So the methods of escape, one is kind of looking out the windows, looking at other faces. There's a kind of tragic form of escape at the end, which is killing herself or drowning herself. But there's another one in there. There's almost a kind of, this is another very classic Gothic story, as I understand it, is The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a tale of, again, a woman trapped. And the one form of escape she has is her interiority, her imagination. I think that's something that's going on throughout this story. Clyde's imagination is wild, full of possibility, and her family often does their best to stamp on that, to ruin it. If they sense her doing any type of odd behavior, they will shut her down. So I found the one major form of escape that I wish she would have kept pursuing rather than calling it quits at the end, but just exploring that inner world, which was under threat, I think, the whole story.
Okay. So we're talking about Clyde as being the what doesn't belong in the story, and understanding her, and I think that that I'm hearing us describe her as positive in ways that maybe don't go with her ending. I mean, how do we think about Clyde? Is she mad? Is she depressed? Is she disabled, misunderstood? Is she searching? I thought we're starting to talk about Clyde's search for faces, and let me read a passage and see if that helps us. Their faces came between her face and another. It was their faces that had come pushing in between long ago to hide some face that had looked back at her. And now it was hard to remember the way it looked, or the time when she'd seen it first. It must have been when she was young. Yes, in a sort of arbor, hadn't she laughed and leaned forward, and that vision of a face, which was a little like all the other faces, the trusting childs, the innocent old travelers, even the greedy barbers and lethies, and the wandering peddlers who one by one knocked and went and answered at the door. Yet different and yet far more, that face had been very close to hers, almost familiar, almost accessible. And then the face of Octavia was thrust between, and at other times the apoplectic face of her father, and the face of Gerald, and the face of her brother Henry with the bullet hole in his forehead. It was purely for a resemblance, which to a vision that she examined the secret, mysterious, unrepeated faces that she met in the street of Forest Gym.
Bill has his hand raised, and then Joe Ellen.
Bill?
Oh, yeah, I was going to mention how often faces came up in the story, and for some reason or another, it reminded me of Narcissus. How Narcissus fell in love with his own image, and by looking in a pond. And the face I think she was looking for was the face of love. And the face she was trying to remember was her own face looking back at her in love that had gotten clouded out by everybody else in the way. And I thought it was Clytemnestra too. I think I saw that in the group chat. Somebody else thought it was, and, which is, of course, is a horrible story. I got to say, I'm new to Eudora Welty, but my favorite story of Eudora Welty is any story I'm reading of hers. She just creates worlds after world after world. And the way she uses language, wow. So anyway, that's just some of my thing. I agree with you about faces. It's key here.
Yeah, I think,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, who was that?
Joe Ellen.
Did you want to finish something, Harriet?
I was just going to say that there's another Clyde, which is the story of a water nymph, the lover of the son of the god Helios or Apollo, who is deserted. And in the end, Clyde lays naked for 9 days on the rock, staring at the sun without drinking or eating. And on the 9th day, in some versions, she pines away into transformation, or another, she's punished by Helios and transformed into a flower that always turns in the direction of the sun. So that's, and then we've got Hermes, and we've got Lethe, and which I think, Hermes is the herald or messenger of the gods, and Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and Hades, and Clyde is also the name of character in Faulkner's Absalom in 1936. I'm just wondering about that layer of mythologizing and if we can do anything with it. But to go back to the idea of searching for a face, and whether it's a specific face that she's searching for, and what does she find, and what happens, to maybe move us through the story, what happens when Clyde touches the barber's face, that makes her panic. Joella, did you have your hand up? And
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to talk about.
Good.
The touch, which also makes a link back to a memory. The barber, in fact, is mentioned in the paragraph that you just read. Her fascination with faces, the child, old travelers, even the greedy barber, whom she is looking at. But before that, we hear about her looking at faces, being exhilarated by faces, but she's always interrupted. She never quite gets where she wants to go. And then the touch of the boy's hand in a memory struck me as the touch, kind of a later touch of the barber's cheek, which she's revolted by. It's by the touch of the invisible beard and the smell of bay rum and all of this stuff. And that might be what kind of sends her over the edge, is that there's finally a face that she touches, even though we learn that she finds the face she was looking for, and she's appalled in that final scene.
Yeah, I'm reading that she put her hand out and with breathtaking gentleness touched the side of his face. For an instant afterward, she stood looking at him inquiringly, and he stood like a statue of Hermes. Then both of them uttered a despairing cry. Mr. Bobo turned and fled, waving his razor around in a circle, down the stairs and out the front door, and Clyde, pale as a ghost, stumbled against the railing. The terrible scent of bay rum, of hair tonic, the horrible moist scratch of an invisible beard, the dense popping green eyes. What had she got hold of with her hand? She could hardly bear it. The thought of that face.
Bobo the clown. I can't get that out of my mind.
Anybody else on Clyde's touch of the barber's face and her panic?
Sarah.
This is such a sad section. I think she wants so much to have human connection. And this is the only person who comes in the house that's not the awful sister and the awful brother and the awful dad. And yet the minute that and I do think her impulse here is also she sees the need in his face. And so it's a lovely impulse, it's a moment, and then she realizes, oh, that's not it. That is not the connection I was going for. If we read this Clyde as Faulkner's Clyde, there's a really important section in Absalom where Rosa touches Clyde on the stairs, and Faulkner goes on, spins for pages about the importance of the touch. That the touch, kind of gets rid of all the theoretical, all the ideal, and it gets you grounded in matter. And so I think that in the memory, the bloody nose, the bather with the sand-like breast, and here the touch of the face kind of cuts through those ideals of connection and love, and just makes it kind of sad and small and physical.
Yeah, I was thinking back to Monica's original comment about two stories together, and thinking about anxiety in both of these stories as the female character is trying to escape. How do we feel about the ending? Some critics call it cruel. I'm reading now to remind us. Clyde swayed a little and looked into the slightly moving water. Of course, it was the face she'd been looking for, from which she had been separated. She's looking at the rain barrel. It was wavering, inscrutable face. The brows were drawn together as if in pain. The eyes were large, intent, almost avid. The nose ugly and discolored, as if from weeping. the mouth old and closed from any speech. On either side of the head, dark hair hung down in a disreputable and wild fashion. Everything about the face frightened and shocked her with its signs of waiting, of suffering. For the second time that morning, Clytie recoiled, and as she did, the other recoiled in the same way. Too late, she recognized the face. She stood there completely sick at heart, as though the poor, half-remembered vision had finally betrayed her. What's happening?
Monica, you had your hand up. Did you still want to make a comment?
Well, I just, building on what y'all were talking about, I'm so interested in how both of these stories are about the destruction of it, are about how icky bodies are and getting rid of any kind of romantic notion of bodies. And you know, the very end of this story, it's such an odd description of her body that we end with. So when old Lethe found her, which again, how wonderful. And as I noted in the chat, and just in case you didn't see it, I discovered this weekend that there are a lot of perfumes called Lethe, which I just think is really strange. But it ends with her poor ladylike black stocking legs upended and hung apart like a pair of tongs, which
Yeah.
is another like weird description of a body, maybe a reference to a kind of forge, right? When I think of tongs in a barrel, I'm thinking, you know, like I'm watching Forged on Fire on TV. But yeah, this is another story where the body is really weird and not romantic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, it struck me that she sees herself in the water, but she's also seeing a self that she didn't expect to see. What she discovers here is the self that she has become since she was maybe the young face that she was looking for before her own youthful state. But this is you know, something that is a face that's devastated and is hers, and it's that final image. You know, I don't know if I'd read the ending as cruel or as sympathetic, but the brutality of turning her into a cartoon image of those black stocking legs separated like tongues is jarring, and it also is maybe the tragedy.
Harriet, Joubert and Pearl have their hands up, and it's 12:53, so we might also want to look for that transition to Old Mr. Marble Hall soon.
That's it. Joubert and Pearl, and then we'll talk about Old Mr. Marplehome.
I'll rescind my comment. We can go ahead to the last story.
Pearl?
I just wanted to say that to me, the penultimate paragraph is even more important than the odd thing that we're left at, because first of all, she thrust her head into the barrel. So it's a deliberate reaching out again, but not recoiling from it as she did touching the barber's face under the water through its glittering surface into the kind, featureless depths and held it there. So as one might read the end of The Awakening, I find some satisfaction in this. She's reaching a kind of peace. It's featureless. Nobody's defining her. It's open and it receives her. And the water is kind. That's just what I want to say.
I like that. Switching to Old Mr. Marplehome. First published in 1938 as Old Mr. Grenada, also in the Southern Review. The year before, James Thurber published The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, a comic story about about a mild-mannered man who drives his wife to her weekly shopping and beauty parlor, and killing time during those trips. He has heroic daydreams. For example, when he's waiting for his wife, he picks up a copy of Liberty magazine and was reading the headlines, "Can Germany conquer the world through the air?" And he begins to daydream becoming a Royal Air Force pilot, volunteering for a daring suicide mission to bomb an ammunition dump. But old Mr. Grenada comes first. Maybe both stories parody gendered fantasies that are in the late 30s, making the pulps a popular genre in the age in which male status is waning. But old Mr. Grenada is quite different than The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. In revising the story to Marble Hall, Welty made changes that emphasized the voice of the character telling the story, and the voice of the story is maybe a puzzle in itself. We could ask, where is that voice coming from? What is that voice? I won't try to open that discussion with the time that we have left, but I'm thinking of that character as a character, as not as Marble Hall, which sometimes is read as, but as a character in the text that is maybe outside of. It's not the town. It's not exactly a Greek chorus, but something like that. We put in the text those three images that are from pulps, and that are the stories that are read both in this story and also in Petrified Man. Maybe we could do something quickly with the question of Mr. Marble Hall, who he is, what his secret life is about, and does it bring him any pleasure?
Jacob has his hand up.
That's a good question. What leads his secret life? I guess in traditional Weltian fashion, where she invites you to revise your thought. If I said earlier that a lot of the classic Gothic stories are trapped femininity, I think you could say with old Mr. Marble Hall, this is a Gothic revision of trapped masculinity. A man that we find out who's old, who's lost his vitality, who never did anything, never got married until he was 60. And then he gets married twice. So we can see perhaps his act upon this feeling trapped is to, escape family. But the great irony is, what does he pursue? Well, he falls into another trap. He gets married again. I'm sensing a thread in all three of these stories about characters who feel both trapped by desire and also unsure of how to move beyond it in a healthy way, where we feel like the frame of their imagination wobbles and falls apart, and then we see them self-destruct in certain ways, not sure of where that next step is. And he's another good example, I would say.
Yeah, that's great. Somebody else? This trapped masculinity and the need to escape from it. There is a moment when Welty in an interview talks about the story, and she says, "I'm meant to express the fantastic life of Natchez, Mississippi, which is where I laid it, where all kinds of crazy stories about families are always going around. But the kind of story that could so easily happen in Natchez. I was sure there are so many double lives going on there. So it's a trapped masculinity, but it's also a particular masculinity. I'm thinking about the description of Marble Hall as a kind of Natchez patriarch, or as a kind of whiteness, that he is short white bangs, a bit of snapdragon in his late lapel. He walked with a big polished stick, a present. He walks luxuriously in Natchez. His wife has gone further than you think into club work. She belongs to the Daughters of the American Revolution, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, attending teas, servile, undelighted, sleepy, expensive, tortured Mrs. Marble, pinning her mind with a pin to her husband's diet. Well, she wants to tempt him. She says, what would he like best that he can have? So it feels to me like a parody of this masculinity, but also about the man's need to escape it. And then, but then there's his escape, his alter ego, or if this is a story about a secret life of bigamy, about doubling property and progeny, about having another family. It's a surprising other family, and what do you think about that?
I can keep us going for about 5 minutes or so. We've got Sarah and we've got Joe Ellen.
Sarah?
So I was just gonna say, your question about the doubling. We do have a kind of Gothic twist in this story with that doubling, the kind of doppelganger of the two sons. And what I noticed this time reading it was we looked through that one son point of view. What if the son followed his father once to the other house and then saw the other son? It's as if there is this other you out there. So I do think there's that kind of Gothic twist in the doubling.
Great. Joe?
I think that the narrator is a really touchy question. Like I would have thought somebody else was saying that, but rather than trapped masculinity, I think the wives. I mean, old Mr. Marblehall married two women at the same time, and set up his double life and is relishing it, despite what the town thinks of him. But the wives, and I don't think enough attention has been paid to the children, at least in what I've kind of noticed over the years. And I'm not quite sure what to do with them either. But this is also a narrative that uses the second person, the familiar you, drawing the audience in. And we really, anyway, that's it for now.
Where is that voice coming from, and why is it speaking? Why is it telling a story? And what does it know? What doesn't it know? All things that we could spend a lot of time on. I wanted to pick up on your talking about the sons and say that Katie Fry, who's often here and is on a plane, unfortunately today while we're meeting, has written about this story, picking up on the idea of Mr. Marblehole's southernness, and suggests that there's a kind of open secret in Marblehole's life that connects to the story's regional context and the antebellum Southern history of white men having second families. And that this other family is his not so white family. And then the little boy who makes the discovery and goes to see the house, and we sense his outrage at the entitlement of the other son. But nobody cares. I mean, to go back to Jacob's point, we're looking at a story in which the doubling, the idea of secret life and hidden secrets is not going to make Mr. Marblehole's life any better. He's got two wives, and they're both frightened of their sons, and they're both maybe more trouble rather than more pleasure.
Pearl's got her hand up. Perhaps Pearl can have our closing comment of the day.
Okay.
That's a little more important than I think I have to say, but I wanted to say, I love how Joe Ellen always helps us to identify or question or lead us to read, to discover what the narrator is doing. So thank you, Joe Ellen. And Harriet, I thought your reading that piece from the interview about Natchez being a place of mystery, a place of double lives, is a beautiful key into thinking about the doubling and all the doubling that's in this. And the one that I'm particularly fond of is that old Mr. Marblehall thinks about there has been an old Mr. Marblehall, like somebody from his past generation or who he imagines he belongs with. In Natchez, ever since the first arrived back in 1818 with the theatrical presentation of Otway's Venice, ending with a laughable combat between two blind fiddlers. And to me, this is the kind of thing that I love in Welty's story. Those are deliberately chosen. Those aren't just offhand. And so it behooves us to look up those, which I did at one time, and now I can't remember what I discovered, but it's important and it's significant and it lends itself to further enjoyment of trying to understand the story and this marvelous character she's created.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about Mr. Marblehall as performer and as performing a kind of masculine identity, trying it again, and it's still not working out. Well, I guess that's where we have to stop for today. And thanks so much for coming and talking to me.
Harriet, thank you for leading our discussions today. I appreciate it so much. Next week on January 29th, we are going to be discussing Flowers for Marjorie, A Curtain of Green, and A Visit of Charity. See you next week.